Okay, shall we get started? Can you hear me back there?
Will we manage without mics?
We'll have to.
We have to manage.
We'll have to manage. Okay. It's not a technologically friendly space. Well, actually, it is. I have a PowerPoint, but it's like you're supposed to read it with the back of your hand, just in case.
That's good gymnastics.
Yeah. So let me introduce Tomas Venclova, a Lithuanian poet, a Yale professor of Russian literature, translator from Polish, among other languages, and a participant in the Soviet dissident movement at some point. So I would like to thank IRES, our institute, for inviting him here on a short notice, and this event was co-sponsored by Lithuanian Embassy in Stockholm. Well, the topic of this evening is poetry as resistance. Tomas Venclova was born in Lithuania, but traveled around, moved to the US at some point, or had to immigrate. And due to his cultural disposition, due to his knowledge of many languages and his openness, he became builder of bridges between many cultures. And his new book is published last year, called Magnetic North: Conversations with American poet Ellen Hinsey. And one of its topics is how poetry can resist to totalitarian, or attempted to resist to totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century, communism and Nazism, and this is one of the sort of central topics. Okay. Here's my PowerPoint. Well, it doesn't have to be. I have this quotation from Marina Tsvetaeva, a poem wrote in 1931 in France. You want to read this one?
In Russian?
Yeah.
Why not?
Well, Professor Venclova, he was my professor at Yale, and he was the most loved professor by his graduate students, because at Yale the priority is given to the undergrads, and he took good care of us. And I think by the number of lines of Russian poetry he's memorized, he's sort of definitely an honorary member of Russian literature as well. So this is a short poem to introduce the topic.
Преодоление косности русской, пушкинский гений, пушкинский мускул на кашалотьей туши судьбы, мускул полета, бега, борьбы. То Серафима сила была, несокрушимый мускул крыла.
So that's a very powerful poem. We're not trying to translate it. You heard the sound. So poetry is a lot about the sound, and I can tell you what's the sort of the idea. The central idea is that Pushkin's genius is epitomized by resistance and struggle against Russia's backwardness and conservatism. among other things. But it's an image of a poet as a fighter or someone showing resistance. This is very well. So, would you like to comment a little bit?
Not immediately.
Not immediately. We'll carry on. Nadezhda Mandelstam was the widow of Osip Mandelstam, as Tomas Venclova would probably say, the greatest Russian 20th century poet. And she saw a poet as someone who challenged the powers that be, and she thought that those in power sensed that. And for instance, in her book of memoirs, she wrote two. They're translated into English. One is Hope Against Hope, and another is Hope Abandoned. And she argued that those the Stalin's henchmen might try to save an actor, but they wouldn't try to save a poet. And this is her quote from Nadezhda Mandelstam. They wouldn't have tried to save a poet. Poetry didn't agree with them at all. Poetry brings out the reader's personality, deepens it, and makes him an accomplice in the poet's cause, something quite impossible for men who control the destinies of whole peoples. The two things are mutually exclusive. So you met Nadezhda Mandelstam?
Yes, several times.
Several times?
Yes, she even came to Vilnius, and I was her guide in Vilnius.
Wow. Tell us more.
Well, probably later.
Okay, probably later.
Probably later.
Why?
Because I am going to introduce myself after your kind introduction.
Kind but erroneous. That was sort of the...
Probably then we will read some poems, two poems in English and then in the original Lithuanian, I think, yes, in that order, with some comments, because the poems need some comment. And then I will probably answer the questions, including a question on Nadezhda Mandelstam or anybody else.
Okay. So you want to go straight to the poems?
No, to the sort of preliminary talk with the audience.
Okay.
Okay.
With the poems?
That's a preliminary talk.
Okay, that's a preliminary talk. Okay. So why do you think Nadezhda Mandelstam's book is so important?
Well, it has to be read to be for its importance to be understood. I hope that many in this audience have read Nadezhda Mandelstam's books.
Okay, but those who haven't, why should they?
Well, it's probably the best book about the Soviet cultural policy and Soviet culture in general, about the fate of the greatest Russian poet of the 20th century. I even consider his book Tristia to be the best poetic book of all times and all languages, including Horace, including Petrarch, and so on. But, well, that's my subjective personal opinion. But so he was murdered, not only by Stalin's henchmen, but by his milieu, I would say, to a very large degree. And it is the best book which helps to understand that particular milieu, I would say.
So the writers.
The writers and, public audience of the Soviet period, and Mandelstam's fate. Brodsky used to say that, well, you know, the Nobel Prize winner Joseph Brodsky, he used to say that there are two good books, really good books. One about both written by women. One about the Soviet Russia, written by Nadezhda Mandelstam, and the second one about Russian emigration, written by Nina Berberova. I recommend both books. And moreover, he said that only women, in that respect he was a feminist, only women were resistant enough to the Soviet regime. Only Akhmatova and Tsvetaeva among the poets, because Pasternak and even Mandelstam were less than resistant to it. They made some compromises. The women made it never. So, well, but that's I hope that's a preliminary answer.
Yeah, that works as a preliminary answer. Okay, the next one, the next of the slides in the ether, it's about Pasternak, Boris Pasternak. Well, there's a comment, is a Czesław Miłosz, the great Polish poet whom you also translated and met and befriended, and he's also Nobel Prize winner in 1980, I think?
1980, yes.
Yeah, 1980. And, well, he lamented in his book, or commented on Pasternak soberly. He wrote that, you know, it's ironic that Pasternak acquired his international fame following the Nobel Prize scandal in 1958, and there was a huge, well, because he couldn't collect it, there was a huge smear campaign, very powerful. So what is a young 20-year-old, how old were you, 22-year-old? It must have been you're writing in this book, I'm also quoting from you, the pressure on Pasternak was unbearable. More than one person believed that he could be executed, or at least imprisoned for a considerable term. Not long before that had been the fates of Babel and Mandelstam. For his novel, Dr. Zhivago, although, as Czesław Miłosz laments, it is ironic because he had been a poet for several decades, and his reputation was established as a poet. So, as a young person in a country which is, you know, creates this smear campaign, and his name has to be repudiated, and he's the enemy of the people. And why were you attracted? Why did you try to meet him, and how did it go?
Well, just because I read his poetry in my youth, and that was also one of the strongest impressions in my life. Next only to Pasternak, next only to Mandelstam. And we, several persons in Vilnius, in Lithuania, we wrote him a letter of support and encouragement, and that letter reached him. And later, one of my friends, who knew Pasternak well, I guess a female person, much older than myself, well, probably not much, she was probably 10 years older than myself, she introduced me to Pasternak. We talked only about half an hour. And the main, well, I was half paralyzed, because that was something like to be introduced to Pushkin or even Shakespeare. And and only Pasternak spoke. And he was advised
That's what the slide looks like.
Yes, he was advised that I try to translate his poetry into Lithuanian, which I did. He said, well, don't do it. My poetry is manneristic, my poetry is pretentious, my poetry is without any words. Only my novel has some word in it, which, well, and now I am writing a play, which presumably will be even better than my novel. I disagreed with him. I have read this novel at that time, although it was banned in the Soviet Union, but it leaked into the country. And I was not extremely fond of that novel, and still am not extremely fond of it. It's good. It's good as a statement, as a philosophical statement, but it is not very good as an artistic work. But his early poetry, in my opinion, is absolutely perfect as artistic work. So I tried very timidly to reassure him that, well, novel is novel, of course, but your poetry and so on and so on. But of course I did not reassure him. By the way, his play, which remained unfinished, it's definitely a failure, and yes, an artistic failure.
But as a poet yourself, you understand the reaction of someone who prefers his more recent work to his earlier stuff.
Well, that's usually the case. That's usually the case. Poets usually prefer their latest work, although they not necessarily are right. I also love early Brodsky, and Brodsky considered his early poetry, he called it kindergarten. Mm-hmm. And and always said, well, but now I did write something really good, which was not absolutely 100% the case. His later poetry was good enough, and there was extremely good craft and so on, but not necessarily better than his early poetry, which I loved. So this is very typical.
Mm-hmm. But talking of Brodsky, I think he commented on Dr. Zhivago. He was also not a fan of Dr. Zhivago, but he said, well, but at least he wrote it человеческим языком, that he wrote this novel in a human language, as opposed to language tarnished by ideology. And,
yes.
And actually that was a huge accomplishment, I would say. Don't you think so?
Definitely, but Brodsky was fond of the poems written
as a part of the novel.
Yes, written allegedly by Dr. Zhivago himself. Of course, they were Pasternak's poems. They are part of the novel. Those poems are definitely very good, and I am also very fond of them, but not of novel. The same about Brodsky. Brodsky was valued the poems better than the fiction part of Dr. Zhivago.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on to Akhmatova. This is another poet. She was friends with Mandelstam and Pasternak, or in Tsvetaeva. Had a very tragic life. You want to maybe later summarize for those who don't know. And well, my sort of there are a couple quotes from your books, both in Russian and English, but the idea is that Akhmatova's resistance was aimed at preservation of memory of the past, against the grain of the official promotion of oblivion on a mass scale and wiping out of history, wiping out of people and their history, sort of, so that no traces is left of people and of certain facts. And this is also very currently relevant phenomena. We are sort of living through it now, so maybe you could comment on her.
Well, I wrote a poem about teaching at Yale, where I teach Akhmatova's poetry, and I feel that something is wrong in my teaching. Then, after the students have left the room, Akhmatova herself appears in my brain, and gives a sort of a lecture on ars poetica, on the poetic craft. This is not exactly her words, but I strongly believe that she would probably subscribe to some of those ideas which I tried to give to the reader in my own poem. It's about a Latin phrase, about a Latin quotation on the
Deus conservatum.
Yes, on the gate of the palace. She lived in that. Well, not in the palace itself, but in a small part of it, which was the servants' quarter before. She used to live there, and
there is her museum.
Yes,
there in St. Petersburg.
Now there is a museum of Akhmatova in St. Petersburg, which I recommend to everybody who comes to St. Petersburg. And this Latin inscription on the gate is Deus conservatum omnia. So God preserves everything.
Okay.
God preserves everything. So she was insisting on that the role of the poet is to preserve at least something, that the poet must imitate the Lord, at least in that, at least this way. Well, this is a poem, and if somebody is interested in it, it is in my book, The Junction.
Junction is a book
of poetry in English.
Okay. So sorry. Okay, let's move on. Well, Alexander Watt, there's another important book, and you wrote a book about the life of this poet, Polish Jewish poet who wasn't very well known in the West, but you also consider this to be a very important book of the 20th century. Why?
Well, this is an autobiography of a person of Jewish origin who wrote in Polish language, who was a communist, well, never a member of the party, but very, very close to the communists, a sort of a fellow traveler. That was, by the way, also the case of my late father. And later he was arrested by the Soviets, spent part of his life in the Soviet prisons and then in the exile, and managed to go to Paris and died there. He wrote a book that is my century, a book of talk, sort of a long interview with Czesław Miłosz. Czesław Miłosz asked him about his life, and Watt answered.
But Czesław Miłosz actually says that he was, in a way a broken man, that he couldn't write the book, and he was invited to Berkeley.
He was invited to Berkeley,
but he couldn't work and kind of felt guilty, and to save him.
Yes, he could not teach. But he was paid. He was paid, and he was extremely ashamed by the fact that he did not work but got money from the American institution.
But he also suffered sort of physically after this torture in the
Yes, and he was really a very sick man, and Miłosz managed to produce a book of talks with Watt, which is one of the more important books about the Soviet totalitarian system, as it, in Poland, but also in the Soviet Union itself, because Watt spent part of his life in the Soviet Union. It's at least as important book as Nadezhda Mandelstam for understanding that period. I was told at Yale that if I want to get a tenure, then I must produce a long monograph in English on some important topic. And Milosz and Polish poet Stanisław Baranczyk and also Brodsky told me that the best idea would be to produce a book on that. He was not very well known in the West, but he made it an introduction to a Western reader, to Western readers, which I did and got my not necessarily well-merited tenure. So, well, that's all I can tell. But already was deceased at that time. But I met his wife, his widow, and his son, who still lives in Paris, and wrote everything that produced. Not very much of it, but also
you read.
I read.
Wrote.
I'm sorry, read.
No problem.
I read everything that wrote, including the archival materials, which were rather numerous in the Beinecke Library at Yale. So, and in 4 years, I produced a book that was my first book in English, which had to be heavily edited. And after the very long editorial work, it got a review in New York Review of Books. And the review said, well, the book is, well, it's interesting and so on, but the best characteristic of it, it's admirable English. I am very shy of my English even today because I am a perfectionist. I hate to do things I do less than perfectly.
We still admire you. Okay, the book is called Life and Art of Iconoclast. Okay, and so, well, I have this long quotation, so you're very lucky that you cannot see it now, because well, and he wrote that people in the West who are not aware of the mental iron barrier will fail to understand much of the relationship between mentality and ideology, and much of the young people's rebellion in the USSR. And young person back then were you, because it was 1965 when he wrote that. And Vard continues, says, in order to liberate themselves from Stalin's heritage in their souls, they must first detach themselves from the enemy. Like a snake shedding its skin in the springtime, they must throw off not only any concern with Stalinism, communism, revisionism, but those ugly words themselves. So this is the insistence on purity of words, and that you can be corrupted by words, and the surrender begins with the language. And this is sort of the light motive a little bit of our talk today. Let's move to Brodsky. And Brodsky, well, it's a quote from his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in 1987, and and he argues that poet is a rival to those in power, and said that literature and poetry is not favored by those in power, and that where a poem has been read, they discover in place of the anticipated consent and unanimity, indifference and polyphony, in place of the resolve to act, inattention and fastidiousness. So essentially subversive activity. And he says that the poet introduces a period, comma and a minus, transforming each zero into a human face. And there's a little drawing of a human face. Any comments on this? Did he overstate the possibility of poet to sort of animate, or well, his idea also in the Nobel acceptance speech that if you read, some good books may make you a better person.
Well, I believe that Stalin made one very important mistake. He banned much of literature. Orwell was banned, Koestler was banned, Joyce was banned, but not everything. All the classical literature had to be banned. There, the regime could entertain a better chance of survival. But you could go.
You don't want to help Stalin, no?
Well, you could still go to the library or even to the bookshop and buy Shakespeare, buy Schiller, buy Pushkin, buy even Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky was semi-banned, but only semi-banned. Crime and Punishment was more or less allowed. The demons were banned. Brother Karamazov was so-so. Yes, Idiot was so-so, but everybody could read Crime and Punishment, for example. Tolstoy was never banned totally, only his philosophical works, which are not necessarily very good. That's another question. But you could read easily War and Peace and Anna Karenina and even Воскресенье, Resurrection, I believe. So, and good literature of any period, of any time, helps to withstand the totalitarian mores, the totalitarian regime, the totalitarian ideology. Be it Cervantes, be it Shakespeare, be it Schiller, be it Pushkin. Then, Brodsky, there is a sort of a joke concerning either Brodsky or one of his close friends. I don't remember who said it, but that was a good, that I believe it's not a bad story. He was asked to go to listen to one underground poet. Brodsky said, I am not interested in him, he is a sort of a Soviet poet. Why Soviet? They told him. He is definitely anti-Soviet. Then Brodsky said, Soviet, anti-Soviet, I don't see much difference. The poet has to be a Soviet. The poet has to be a Soviet, paying not much attention to the Soviet regime. And that is that.
So ignore it completely.
Ignoring it. And that is the best way of fighting it. And the Soviets felt it very well, by the way. Brodsky never, sometimes he wrote lines which could be interpreted as strictly anti-Soviet, that's true. For example, there is his poem «Халуй трясется, раб хохочет». Well, I will read it in Russian, maybe some of you will understand it. «Халуй трясется, раб хохочет, палач свою секиру точит, тиран кромсает каплуна, сверкает зимняя луна, севит отечество гравюра, на лежаке солдат и дура, старуха чешет мертвый бок, севит отечество лубок, собака лает, ветер носит, Борису Глеба в морду просит, кружатся пары на балу, в прихожей куча на полу. Луна сверкает, зренье муча, под ней, как мозг, отдельной туча. Пускай художник поразит, другой пейзаж изобразит. So it's a
very irreverent.
Yes, very irreverent poem about Russia. About Russia. It was written after he visited an exhibition of old drawings done in the Peter the Great's period. And Russia in those drawings appears as a rather unpleasant place to live. He describes it in detail, but it's easy to understand that he speaks not only about the Peter the Great's Russia, but also about the Soviet Union, and ends with words. Let this drawer, this painter, this artist, let this artist to draw a different landscape. So it is anti-Soviet, and finally he got that different landscape, which was the American landscape. That was in a sense a prophetic poem. So so every living word, not even necessarily a living word, sometimes even a dead word, but a living word was always, absolutely always anti-Soviet. It always worked against the regime.
Mm-hmm. But how? I mean, how did it happen that words became dead? You know, so Vatt is talking about it.
No,
You're talking about it.
Well, this is described in detail by Orwell in the in the addenda to his famous 1984, where he explains what the newspeak is.
Okay. All right. Okay, next slide. Don't worry. Reading it, W.H. Auden, Brodsky. Love this poet. You also translated. Did you translate any of his poems into Lithuanian?
I translate several of Auden's poems into Lithuanian, even living in Lithuania. That was more than 40 years ago. And even, I translated the poem about in memoriam of Yeats, and also September the 1st, 1939, which Auden himself disliked.
Later rejected.
Yes, rejected. But then later I translated several more poems by Auden, but that's another story. Mm-hmm. But I sent my translations to Auden himself. It reached him, and he wrote me a very polite, but not a very special, so to speak, letter.
He didn't understand Lithuanian.
Well, but he wrote something like, I am happy to see my poetry in this interesting language. I know that, yes, I know that the translator's job is very difficult and paid very badly, something like that. That was Auden's letter with his signature. Now it is preserved as a relic of culture in Vilnius, in the Institute of Lithuanian Literature. But that was only the beginning. When Brodsky was exiled from the Soviet Union, I presented him with a bottle of very strong Lithuanian liquor of 70 grapes.
What's it called?
Malūnininkas, that means a miller. A miller. And told Brodsky, you will definitely meet Auden, then you should drink that bottle together. And Auden, by the way, was a heavy drinker. Brodsky was not necessarily a heavy drinker, but he could drink as almost every poet can.
But by the way, this anecdote is in this book.
Yes.
So.
Well, all the anecdotes I tell are in this book. So, this is a sort of commercial for the book.
If you like the anecdotes, you can get more of the line.
But the story goes this way. Well, you should go to Auden and to drink it together. In several weeks after Brodsky left, I got his postcard. He said, well, we met, I met W.H., that was Auden, and we did everything requested. Later I visited the house where Auden lived in Austria. He died there and he is buried there in Kirchstetten.
On Odenstrasse.
In Kirkstetten. Have you been there?
No, not yet.
And there is a sort of a private museum on the attic he lived in the attic he lived in. And there is a small part of it dedicated to the empty bottles he drank there. Well, there are
it's a large part.
Well, no, probably 10 bottles or something. Definitely a very small part of the bottles which were consumed there. Of course, I looked for the Lithuanian bottle, but I did not find it. That's the end of the story.
Thank you. Well, anyway, the quote was the quote from Auden is that, as well, in the 30s we know, and this was the book they went to report on war between China and Japan, is the journey to war, and he was, well, in the 30s sort of engagé poet, but then he took recoiled from it, and then he said, by all means, let a poet, if he wants to, write an engagé poem protesting against this or that social evil or injustice, so long as he doesn't imagine that it will alter anything. So this was his sort of pessimism, and he also said, poetry...
Yes, makes nothing happen.
Yeah.
It survives.
It survives, yes. In a value of its saying, where executives, etc., etc. Well, but then he, sort of reiterates the same idea. The poet, qua poet, has only one political duty, by his own example, to try to preserve the purity of language against corruption and misuse. For when words lose their meaning, then physical force gives the orders. So
that's absolutely correct, and definitely Brodsky subscribed to it, and my humble person also subscribes to it. I would only say that sometimes poetry makes something happen, but in a very roundabout ways, and in the ways never known by the poet himself. But sometimes it happens. That was the case of Czesław Miłosz. His poetry changed the atmosphere in Poland to some, but quite perceptible degree, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then there is this famous poet that you mentioned, the elegy to W.B. Yeats, 1939, which you translated into Lithuanian. Brodsky based his elegy to T.S. Eliot in Russian on its form, and it has these lines, very famous lines. Time that is. You want to read them?
Well, my English is bad for that.
Okay, time that is intolerant of the brave and innocent, and indifferent and weak to a beautiful physique, worships language and forgives everyone by whom it lives, pardons cowardice, conceit, lays its honours at their feet. Time that time with this strange excuse pardoned Kipling and his views, and will pardon Paul Claudel, pardons him for writing well. Well, later Auden actually took this part out because he thought it was too patronizing to Paul Claudel and sort of imposing his own political views. And there's like a big question that we're moving to our next topic. Should a poet be pardoned for errors of judgment, or can his achievements, as you said, like what Miłosz did for Poland, can they outweigh sort of errors of judgment? Well, and this is I also wanted to quote this martial law carol, which was apparently based on this. It's a Brodsky 1982 poem. Maybe you could give a little historic introduction to the martial.
Well, you know that when General Jaruzelski introduced martial law in Poland, some of Brodsky's friends were imprisoned, including Viktor Voroshilsky, who was a good poet and a specialist in Russian letters, and including Andrei Blavich, who was also a specialist in Russian letters. I was lucky enough to know both of them. And he dedicated a poem to them, to his imprisoned friends. Years later, they were released and everything ended well. But
I mean, 100 people died.
Well, not 100 less, but it does not matter. Yes, every dead person is one person too much, as they say. Well, many people died, but that was in the Vujek's mine. He speaks about the Vujek's mine, miners. They were shot by the Jaruzelski's soldiers, and the poem reached Voroshilsky and Blavich in their prison. They read it. And Brodsky said, and he was perfectly right, that that was much more pleasant experience for him, for Brodsky, than the Nobel Prize.
Well, to know that it gave
support. Yes, to know that they got the poem, that they read the poem.
Yeah, I'll just read the first and the last stanzas of it. One more Christmas and soaking stripes and stars, all my Polish friends are behind steel bars, locked like zeros in some graph sheet of froth. As a discipline, slavery beats math. Powerless in speech, still its best satire, in attempt to reach, crossing the frontier for the heavy hearts of my Polish friends. One more trial starts, one more Christmas ends. Well, Brodsky was, of course, Russian, and English wasn't his native language, so this is quite an achievement, although British have criticized his English. But it's very much in the manner of 1st September 1939 by W.H. Auden. You also wrote a poem in that manner, you told me, on 9/11.
That's a long story. I wrote a poem not imitating Auden, but almost. That was September 11th.
It's your birthday?
That happens to be my birthday. Now, when I give my birthday, let us say to doctors and so on, everybody says, 11th of September, you have chosen the very wrong birthday. So, at that particular day, I came to my office and I already invited some of my graduate students and some of my colleagues to the birthday party. That was 11th September. And when I came in, one of my graduate students told me, a minute ago, a plane struck the tower of the World Trade Center. I said, my goodness, what an unhappy accident, something like that. Then, in my eyes, on the TV screen, then another plane struck the second tower. I said, this is not an accident. This is the beginning of the Third World War. Of course, the birthday was revoked. The Third World War did not start, or maybe it did, but it goes in a different way than the World War II. And later, in a month or two, I went to New York. And I went to a bar by Roman Kaplan, which is called Russian Samovar, one of the famous bars in New York. Of restaurants in New York, established by a Russian emigre, good friend of Brodsky and Baryshnikov, whom I also know personally. And I went to that bar, I sat down, drank some vodka, and Then I found out, then I remembered that the bar is on the 52nd Street. I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid. That's the beginning of the Oden's poem.
Yeah, which is 1st September 1939,
yes.
The beginning of the Second World War.
Yes, the beginning of the Second World War. Now it was around Christmas, it was December, several months after the story, or yes, after the attack on the towers. But still it was very much felt in New York, and the mood of the people, in the weather, so to speak, in the atmosphere of Manhattan. And then I wrote a poem about that. It is called Anno Domini. It has a title, Anno Domini, and it gives some quotation of Oden's poem in my own translation, but speaks about a new war, and a new beginning of a new precarious, dangerous, terrible era. So, well, yes, the poem has been translated into English, but we don't have its text, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately.
Okay, let's move on. Well, and then, so this was Martial Law Carol. This was a poem with political sort of reaction to immediate political events, which gave this solace and support to the Friends. And then there's this other poem published in 1993 on independence of Ukraine, in which Brodsky vented his very negative views, dim views of feelings of. Had dim views of the event, but in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, it acquired a different significance, and all this sort of his impeccable reputation of freedom fight and this resistance to totalitarian regime became tarnished by this controversy. So, I mean, it is unfortunate, but it is sort of a cautionary tale to a point. Maybe you shouldn't write on political reportage. I mean, can you comment on that?
Well, a poet may and can and sometimes even should write political poems, in my opinion. Of course, it depends on the poet. Some poets are physically unable to write political poems, but some are perfectly able. Brodsky was one of them. And, well, he wrote a poem against the Ukrainian independence, which now is used by the Russian imperialist-minded personalities as a proof that Brodsky was one of us, that he was ours. I can also tell a story about that. Maybe not a very modest story, but because it involves also my humble person. But Brodsky read this poem to me when it was still in the manuscript stage. And I told him, the poem, technically it was very well written, in my opinion. Very well written and very funny in a sense. But I told him, don't publish it, and never read it publicly. The only place where it could be read publicly is Kiev, the Ukrainian capital. They would lynch you, definitely, but that would be fair play. That would be fair play. So he said, oh, well, okay, and he never published the poem. But he read it once to the Canadian audience, I believe. It was...
he also read it at Queen's College.
Maybe. It was recorded...
How do you know?
It was recorded and printed, and that was bad. That was bad. There are various interpretations of that poem. For example, the fact that Brodsky's family himself comes from Ukraine, from the town of Brody next to Lvov or Lviv. and so on and so on. But it would be better if the poem remained unpublished at least for the 50 more years. Unfortunately, it did not happen, and now it's...
yeah, well, now Dmitry Bykov is making his career on it. Well, this is like little... he wrote that Brodsky is the poet of the Russian world. I don't think it's just, it's a distortion.
Well, Dmitry Bykov is not a bad critic, in my opinion. He is a talented critic of very strong opinions, and sometimes wrong opinions, definitely, sometimes correct opinions, but he's talented. I used to compare it to Kornei Chukovsky before the revolution. Kornei Chukovsky before the revolution was a popular critic who explained to everybody everything about symbolism, about futurism, in a rather flat way, but still in a funny and interesting way and useful way, I would say. So Bykov is a sort of Kornei Chukovsky of our own times, I would say. And I don't consider Bykov a bad critic or a bad man, but his opinion about this particular poem is incorrect in my view.
Well, Brodsky himself made this points. He strangely defended this Mandelstam's poem about Stalin, which Mandelstam tried to ingratiate himself and save his life, but it didn't work out. But Brodsky thought, it's still a great poem.
Well, time which, with a strange excuse, pardoned Brodsky and his friends, pardons him for writing well.
Yeah.
Yes, here I agree with
and with Auden. Okay, well, that was the reason why I brought up this Auden quote. Okay, let's move on to Vilnius. Vilnius, I read the longing for the world culture is from your book.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I quote, virtually everyone in Lithuania has mixed roots. My father came from a peasant Lithuanian-speaking family, but my mother's parents belonged to nobility for whom the principal language was Polish. Today, one notices a tendency to simplify the picture. A Lithuanian is a Lithuanian, a Pole's a Pole, and now nationalists dream about mono-ethnic countries. Vilnius is now a Lithuanian-speaking city where traces of Polishness are not necessarily encouraged. I continue to hope that this primitive attitude, fraught with conflicts, will not ultimately prevail. In this, Miloš and I were in full agreement. So, question to you, is the idea of Lithuanian ethnic homogeneity a lie, a historic substitution, an aberration, a myth?
Well, Vilnius, maybe some of in the audience have been to Vilnius, and if somebody has not, I strongly recommend it. It's an absolutely magic city, not necessarily very beautiful. For example, Riga. Well, Riga looks like Stockholm, almost like Stockholm or Hamburg. This is a typical big European city, big European capital. Tallinn looks like a small German city on the romantic road, like Rothenburg or something like that. But Vilnius is very special. It has nothing in common with the German or Scandinavian type of cities. It's rather Italian to some degree, maybe similar to Padova, to Bergamo, to Vicenza, to smaller Italian cities in northern Italy, because it was built mainly by Italian architects. But it is chaotic. It has lots of badly looking parts and so on and so on. But But it has some magic, which was noticed by Miloš, for example. Miloš always called it a magic city. For example, Paris is not a magic city. It is a beautiful city and a very important city, but not necessarily a magic city.
Yeah, we forgot to mention, but if you read this book, you'll figure out that Miloš was native of Vilnius.
Yes, Miloš was...
But he was the greatest Polish poet of the century, but born in the same city. So two great poets were born. Well, I'm not.
Another one was Adam Mickiewicz.
Another one, Adam Mickiewicz. Vilno or Chisno.
Well, they were both not born in Vilnius, but they graduated from the Vilnius University, both of them. And the city at that time was a Polish-speaking city. So Vilnius is chaotic. Vilnius is ugly in many parts. Sometimes very beautiful, but it has some magic which is unrivaled even by Paris, I would say. I think I quote in the book, give a quotation from a travelogue written by a Lithuanian student who visited Europe in the early 30s of the 20th century. There is a famous quotation: "We came to Florence, a beautiful city like Vilnius, although worse."
Although worse.
And I virtually agree with him. Vilnius has some magic that even Firenze does not have.
Okay.
But speaking about the ethnic composition of Vilnius, it was Polish-speaking until 1940s and even later. There were also Russians and other ethnic groups, and especially big Jewish community, which was totally destroyed during the war. It was big, partly Yiddish-speaking, partly Russian-speaking, by the way. Of course, they knew also Polish as a rule, but among themselves they speak either Yiddish or sometimes Russian. But that community was destroyed, and now Vilnius is monoethnic, almost monoethnic. There exists some Polish community, there exists a Russian community, but they are very marginal today, and that's a loss. That's a loss. The magic of Vilnius, to a very large degree, belonged and still belongs to the fact that it is a multilingual city, multilingual and multi-ethnic, multi-religious city. So I do my best for preserving this multicultural character of Vilnius, not necessarily very successfully, but still I and some of my friends are doing something for retaining this character of Vilnius.
Well, you've become sort of yourself a little bit of a wandering Jew, or maybe it's too much of a strong word, a little Jewish. No, I mean you've lived everywhere.
Well,
okay.
You know, there is a famous play by Max Frisch, Don Juan or the Love of Geometry.
No.
But there is a play, and one of my female friends used to call me Don Juan or the Love of Geography. Of geography.
So you've been around. You've traveled. Yes. You've just come from China, and you're telling us that you've actually now moving to Vilnius, back to Vilnius.
Yes, I am moving back to Vilnius from the United States. I became a professor emeritus 6 years ago. Now I have not much to do in New Haven, and we, together with my wife, we decided to move to Vilnius.
So well, this is the last slide before the poems and the general discussion. It's called like Vilnius, the Jerusalem of the North, the famous quote, and this is in 1975 you wrote an article, Jews and Lithuanians. Its main theme was a call for repentance for the June 1941 Kaunas pogroms.
Not necessarily for only Kaunas pogroms. The pogroms took place in throughout Lithuania, including Vilnius, and well, that was the blackest page in the history of Lithuania.
And this was the first attempt to build a bridge between Jewish and Lithuanian communities. Later attempts were not maybe as successful now. Here's this Ruta Vanagaitė, the best-selling author of this book, Mūsiškai, Our People, and dealing with the role of Lithuanians in the Holocaust. And she recently became on the receiving end of vicious smear campaign in Lithuania, and they try to destroy her books. So what's your take on?
The book Our People is a good book in my opinion, and it says something very important, that those people who killed were our people, and the people murdered, the Jewish people were also our people. Sometimes they were before the war they might be friends, for example. They might be classmates, and an ethnic Lithuanian classmate murdered his Jewish classmate. The book is about that. The book is, it has some commercial tinge on it. One must confess that it has it. But it is well written, and it is very impressive. And it made a big impression on the Lithuanian public. The first book which was written for a common people. There are lots of books written by historians on the Holocaust in Lithuania, but that was the first book written for the common public, common audience.
But anti-Semitism is still a huge
Anti-Semitism
problem.
is still a latent problem in Lithuania, latentная проблема.
Yeah, latent.
Now, but later,
There are no Jews, but it's still...
Well, there are some Jews, but the community is very small. But there are some important people in it. For example, a philosopher, Leonidas Donskis, who died recently, and ghetto survivor, Irena Veisaitė, who is 95, but still very active, by the way, and very important personality in today's Lithuania. But there are definitely two or three visible Jewish people in Lithuania. And the book became a bestseller. It was well bought. It was generally created lots of interest, lots of commotion. But later, Ruta Vanagaitė, a bit, she did, I think she did a mistake. She attacked one of the Lithuanian guerrillas or partisans of the post-war period, who was a hero for many Lithuanians, and who was not involved in the crimes. He was definitely not involved in the crimes because, for example, the ambassador of Israel in Lithuania also paid homage to him. So, but she attacked him, and then the terrible campaign after her started. The anti-Semites took part in the campaign. They could say nothing about the book, although they would be very happy to say something about the book, but they could not. But about that story about this partisan leader, they could tell about Ruta Vanagaitė terrible things. The publishing house, by the way, the head of the publishing house was a Komsomol member and a Soviet activist in the Soviet times. He said, well, this war attacked our hero. We will burn all of her books, including, of course, the book Mūsiškai. Then somebody explained that smacks, to put it mildly, it smacks of fascism, of Nazism. Then the head of the publishing house said, well, we will give the books back to her. She may sell the books herself, which she did. which he did, by the way. But there was a terrible smear campaign. Vytautas Landsbergis, who is, well, in a sense, head of the Lithuanian independence movement, very famous person, probably the most famous in Lithuania. He wrote a letter to the press addressing this lady Rūta Vanagaitė and saying her, please go to the forest, find a tree and hang yourself. And so on.
Has he lost his mind?
He a bit lost his mind. Well, then I wrote also a public letter to the Lithuanian press saying that I am not a historian. I am not expected to judge the merits or the merits of Ramanauskas Vanagas, this partisan leader, but the campaign against Rūta Vanagaitė is absolutely unacceptable. The terms in which she is attacked, those terms are absolutely unacceptable. This reminds one of the Soviet period when, for example, Pasternak was attacked in a similar way. That only shows the profound impact of the Soviet heritage on the Lithuanian public opinion. So I wrote something like that. That was published as well. Then I was also attacked, but less than Vanagaitė. I am attacked in Lithuania frequently enough. I got used to it, but also have some people who agree with my opinions. So that was the story of Vanagaitė. This is a terrible story which gives you the feeling of the latent anti-Semitism and the latent hatred, I would say just hatred, still existing in my country. Well, the only thing to help here is to do one's best for trying to, to correct it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and talking of history, you just written a book on Lithuanian history. So it's not true that you're not a historian, right?
I am not a historian. I am a historian of culture. I'm a historian of literature, and not necessarily of Lithuanian literature. I used to teach Russian literature and Polish literature. Although if necessary, I could probably also teach Lithuanian literature, which I did once in Tartu, under Lotman's edges, so to speak. But I was proposed to write a history of Lithuania from the very beginning, that means 42,000 years ago, and to our own times. So I did it. I hesitated to do it because I'm not a historian, but finally they convinced me. The publishing house convinced me that it would make some sense, and they started. The book consists of several chapters. The first chapter has a title, The First 42,000 Years. Then the next chapter is the 12th century, the 13th century, the 14th century, and so on. The 19th century, there are two chapters about the 19th century and 2 chapters about the 20th century. Now, the first volume has already appeared, and after Uppsala and Stockholm, I am expected to go to Vilnius for promotion of that first volume. But it ends on the year 1795, when Lithuania was occupied by the Tsarist Russia. And then now I am in the final chapters of the 20th century, describing the Holocaust, the Lithuanian anti-Soviet partisan movement, such very sensitive topics. Well, I write in the more or less in the same vein as Rūta Vanagaitė. It will probably create lots of controversy, but one has to do what one has to do.
Okay, and let's do the poem now, then.
Okay, now, well, the poems need some comments. First of all, we probably will read it first in English, then in Lithuanian.
Let's do the reverse.
We may do the reverse, yes. The first poem, well, the Lithuanian, some in the audience are Lithuanian speakers, but some are not. For those who don't know the Lithuanian, I can tell you that is one of the 6 classical Indo-European languages. There are 6 languages: Sanskrit, Ancient Greek, Latin, Gothic, in which Ulfilas Bible was written, Church Slavic, and Lithuanian. Among those 6 languages, only Lithuanian is alive and kicking, and kicking very actively, I would say. We have hundreds of newspapers and magazines. We have thousands of books in Lithuanian. We have more than 10 very good theaters in Lithuanian language, TV and everything. So now, well, it may be interesting for you to hear the sound of the language. The first poem is about Maria Kuzmina Karavayeva. Maria Kuzmina Karavayeva, well, she was Yelizaveta Kuzmina Karavayeva, but she was a nun, and as a nun she was called Mother Maria, Mother Mary. She was, in the beginning of her career, if one could use such words, she was a symbolist poet, a minor symbolist poet, a friend of Alexander Blok. She knew everybody in that milieu, and her youth was quite interesting in many senses. Then she became a nun in Russian emigre milieu in Paris. Then she perished during the German occupation, since she took part in the French resistance movement. There is a legend about her death, which I retell in my poem. The legend most likely is apocryphal, as they say. It's not necessarily true. But that is the legend, how she saved a girl, a Christian girl, by the way, not a Jewish girl, who was condemned to death by Gestapo. She saved her. I tried to imagine the fate of that saved girl, and it came to my mind that it could be perfectly banal, perfectly and even unhappy. Was it worth it? Was it worth it saving such life? So this is a sort of an ironic turn in the poem. But you will see the text. Now I read it in Lithuanian. Apie jos paskutinį gyvenimo tarpsnį stinga žinių. Daug liudytojų žuvo, kiti gal svarbiausi, mirė netrukus po karo. Be to konspiracija. Taip, žiemos velodromas, šiukšlių konteinerius pavyko išgabenti 4 vaikus. Iš viso jų buvo 200. Bendrabutį, kurį kadaise buvo įsteigus, rasdavo guolį ir maistą pabėgę belaisviai. Maža spaustuvėlė gamino suklastotus popierius, teigusius, jog patiekėjas priklauso deramai rasiai. Beje, prižiūrėtojai leisdavo retkarčiais teikti paguodą pasmerktiesiems myriop. Tradicinis gestas neatšauktas tik toje srityje, nes gauleiteris buvo iš katalikų šeimos. Kaip sako šaltiniai, ji kameroje sykį prakalbino jauną mergaitę. O toji atšovė, ką jūs čia plepat? Jokio dievo nėra, nes jeigu jis būtų, išvestų mane iš kalėjimo. Ji ir pati suprato, jog dievas ilsis bombos kraterį, guli duobėj su kulka smilkiny, pūva po kerpėmis stumbloj. Todėl ji nusimetė abitą. Pasirūpino, kad kaliniai prisidengtų galvą sijoną ir kurpes. Pati atsisėdo ant čiužinio, nugrėžė veidą nuo durų. Kalėjimo sargas, atėjęs po valandėlės, palydėjo baugščiai žingsniuojantį juodą siluetą lyg vartų. Dokumentų netikrino niekas. Mes radom išgelbėtą moterį kiek per vėlai. Ji gyveno daug metų, glaudės bute, netoli geležinkelio. Po langu kasdieną žvangėjo platformos, dūmai skverbėsi bronchus. Vėlavo lietingas rytas. Jis skubėjo į darbą šaligatvių tarp supurvintų lapų, valanda lygi miesto kontoron, kuri pradžioje užtikrino algą, tačiau bankrutavo per krizę. Daug tų kontorų. Kaskart, kai baigėsi mėnuo, apstulbina sąskaitų sumos. Iširo šeima, tiksliau tai nebuvo šeima. Augintinį greitai paliko namus ir nerašė laiškų. Keptuvei čirškėjo trynys. Kas vakaras veidrodį ryškėjo gausėjančios raukšlės, glebios krūtys, iššokusios violetinės venos. Vienatvė ir kūno irimas. Beje, alkoholis irgi padarė savo. Kaip anksčiau, ji mechaniškai dažėsi lūpas. Naktimis kai kada sapnavo kalėjimą, dieną stengėsi neprisiminti, paskui visai neprisiminė dėl Alzheimerio. Tiesą sakant, tai buvo išganimas. Kas nors tikriausiai paklaus, ar vertėjo už josios lemtį vieną iš daugelio tūkstančių, tarsi skatikas ar pašto ženklas neįskaitomų piešinių, sumokėti šitokią kainą. Mes nežinom, kaip žuvo vienuoliai, galbūt dujų kameroj, gal nuo fenolo infekcijos. Suminėti jos nuodėmes lengva. Jaunystė tarytum Marijos Magdalenos, vaikai nesuradę gyvenimo kelio, nedogmatiškos eilės. Jei dažnokai prailgdavo mišios, taip pat jų perstojo rūkė žitan, kaip niekas neprideda abitui. Viena tik aišku, ji neklausė savęs, ar vertėjo mokėti tą kainą. Kaip neklausė tas, kurį jį trumpam pavadavo.
The process of beatification. Our knowledge of her life's end is limited. Many witnesses perished, others, perhaps the most important, died shortly after the war. Further, secrecy reigned. Yes, the Vel d'Hiver, refashioned waste bins brought to safety 4 children, though 200 of them remained. In the hostel she established years before, bed and sustenance, awaited escaped prisoners of war. A small printing press fashioned identity papers affirming the bearers belonged to the proper race. Incidentally, warders did permit, if but occasionally, comfort for those condemned to death, a traditional right never revoked in that quarter, since the Gauleiter came from a Catholic family. Some sources state she once spoke with a young girl in a cell who angrily proclaimed, "This is rubbish, there is no God, because if there were, he would release me from this prison." The nun knew only too well that God lay in a bomb crater's abyss, in a pit, a bullet through the back of the skull, rotting beneath the tundra's lichen. She therefore removed her nun's habit, instructed the prisoner to conceal her hair, skirt and shoes. Then she sat on the bed, turned her face from the door. The guard, arriving a moment later, accompanied the timid black-clothed silhouette to the gate. No documents were checked. We located the rescued woman a bit too late. Her long life, spent by a railway's embankment, beyond her window, freight cars clattered by, smoke pervaded the lungs' bronchi. Rainy mornings she ran late, rushed to work over sidewalks strewn with dirty leaves, 1 hour into the city to an office that at the outset offered income, but like so many went under with the world's downturn. At the end of every month, the bills were daunting. The family was divided, but then it was hardly a family. An adopted daughter soon departed, failed to write. Yolks hissed in the frying pan. Each night the mirror showed spreading wrinkles, flaccid breasts, protruding violet veins, solitude, the body's slow decline. By the way, alcohol did its job as well. As before, she mechanically made up her lips. At night, in dreams, she sometimes saw the prison. During the day, she tried not to recall it, then ceased to remember the whole affair, due to Alzheimer's, to tell the truth, a sort of salvation. No doubt, someone might ask, was the price too high to exchange fates with one of thousands, like a penny, or postage stamp embossed with an eligible face? We do not know how the nun perished. Perhaps the gas chamber, perhaps injection by phenol. Her own sins aren't hard to enumerate. A youth spent like Mary Magdalene, her own children unable to find their way, some occasional verse, frequently bored at Mass. She was known to chain smoke gitane, unbefitting of her nun's habit. But one thing is certain, she never asked herself if it was worth the price, as the Lord, whose place she fleetingly took, never asks.
And now the second poem, it's shorter. It's about the street in Vilnius where I spent my youth, about three of my friends. One of them was the head of the Lithuanian Helsinki group. He died. The second one, a Russian girl, by the way, not a Lithuanian girl. I was in love with her for a short time, a platonic love to be precise. She became famous as a doctor, very famous. She moved from Vilnius to Moscow and became one of the most famous persons in Moscow because she created the first hospice in Russia. She also died. I managed to meet her in her last years. And then the third person, my very best friend, who was a journalist, and he wrote on ecology, ecological problems. He also does not live anymore. So about the street and about three persons connected with that street. Nuošaliai, netriukšminga, ne kartą keitusi vardą, rašyta skirtingom kalbom. Jaunatvis, lokus amenus, tarp alaus dalyklos, šlapių pavarčių, randuoto tinko ir paminklo, kurį kas dešimtmetis žadama kliauti. Tie patys keliai mokyklon, kaip prieš karą, kitoj valstybei, lygiai taip pat gaišuoja vasaros saulė ant mūrų. Abejinga sostinė, vargšas gubernijos miestas. Mūsų buvo nedaug, beveik visi iš kitoniškų plotų. Anksti supratom, imperija moka palaužti bet kurį. Svečiai pasibeldžia vidurnaktį, o toliau nežinia. Tiesą sakant, žinia. Bet mūsiškis metas buvo kitoks, veikiau panašus į klampynę. Kambariai, kur gyvenom, nustemba, kai ten apsilankom. Kalvos šalia trupančių sienų užmiršo žodžius, kuriais dalėjomės tąsyk, dirsčiodami per petį. Buvom beveik tokie pat, kaip kelios vyresnės kartos, rengusios lūšnose sąmokslus, bandžiusios keisti pasaulį. Ačiū Dievui, netroškom valdžios, nebent atminimo. Viskas virto išblukusių kopilių, kylinčių orų. Lošys vežimėlyje neatpažįsta bičiulio, stambi sena moteriškė, kadaise gražuoliai sukniumba prie lovos, nespėjus darban. Šiauniausia vyrą pakirto alkoholis ir plaučių vėžys. Ne istorija juos įstūmė į tamsą, bet kasdieniškos bėdos. Kas be ko, istorija stengės. Užtrukęs tarp šlaito ir pranykusio amžiaus frontonų, pagaunu tik baltą triukšmą iš niekieno žemės, kuriame sutirpo jų sąmojai maldos kivirčiai. Jei bandau juos kalbinti, jie paprastai neatsako, tik stabteli priekimuoj. O kada atsiliepia, sunkoka suprasti, ar tai jų, ar esančio balsas.
South of the Prospect, secluded, mostly tranquil, but periodically renamed in various languages, the locus amenus of our youth ran between the brewery, wet archways, scarred plaster and a statue, threatened each decade with demolition. The path to school before the war in a bygone state. Still, February's sun lingers on brick walls, as before. An indifferent capital, a poor city of the provinces, we were only a few, most came from other places, but all immediately understood. The empire could break you. If midnight visitors knocked, next came the unknown, in truth known to everyone. But our time was a bit different, closer to quagmire. Our former rooms are astonished at our presence. Hills by decaying walls no longer recall the words we exchanged back then, glancing over shoulders, not unlike older generations conspiring in penury, striving to change the world. Thank God we didn't crave power, if anything, only to be remembered. All now transformed into faded paper, to silent air. In a wheelchair one doesn't recognize a friend. The stout old woman, a former beauty, collapses bedside before work. The stylish man is defeated by drink, lung cancer. Not history, but commonplaces drive him into darkness, even if history tried its best. Late between hills and gables of vanished century, I catch only white noise from the no man's land, where their wit, prayers and quarrels have faded. If I try to reach them, they mostly fail to answer, just pause in twilight. If they respond, it's hard to discern if it is them or the one who always is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank you.
We've arrived now.
Well, if we still have some time and some desire, we could try to answer some questions. We spent an hour and a half, maybe another 15 minutes or something like that.
Arvidas.
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 Sorry.
Thank you for the fascinating discussion or presentation or speech or whatever you call it. But the lecture, it was called Poetry as Resistance. So my question is, nowadays, what is there to resist for poetry?
What is to resist?
Yeah.
Well, I told it already, I believe. I believe, well, to do something which is told you by your daemonion, so to speak. Just to follow your own way, your own path, and just never capitulating to your milieu, to your era, to your time. Well, I would say a person never chooses the time and the place to live, but a person can always choose his or her own fate. And this choosing of the independent fate is a resistance. Yeah, the resistance. That's my answer. Sorry if I did not answer it well enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes. Let's return to the overarching topic of our discussion, which is poetry as resistance. And building on your previous comment, which I like so much, about female poets who are not ready to strike a compromise with the oppressive powers that be. I think that it would be proper to bring up the name of, I think, very beautiful female poet, Natalia Gabaniewska.
Oh, yes.
Natalia Gabaniewska, of course, besides being a very nice poet, is famous by the fact that she was one of a member of a very tiny group which went to the Red Square in August 1968 to protest the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia. I know that Natalia translated your poetry.
Yes.
So did you translate hers? And how would you assess her oeuvre in general?
Well, Natalia Gorbanevska was a very good poet. And this is, well, it's a pity that her dissident fame exceeds her poetic fame. This is, well, that could also happen to Brodsky, but it did not. To Gorbanevska it happened. In the beginning, they were almost as she was almost as famous as Brodsky. And you know, Akhmatova once told to Brodsky, there are a group of you, Brodsky, Naiman, Rein, Bobyshev, there were the so-called Akhmatova's orphans, a group of male poets who tried to entertain similar poetics, I would say, and Brodsky was brought up in that milieu. He was much better than every one of his friends, but at that time it was not yet so visible as it became later. And Akhmatova told Brodsky, you should have a female member of your group. It always happens. The symbolist had Zinaida Gipius. The acmeist had my humble person, that's Akhmatova. The futurist had Yelena Guro. You should take Gorbanevska. She writes in a similar vein, and she is a beautiful person, a nice person. Well, the problem was that they lived in Leningrad or Petersburg, and she lived in Moscow. I liked her poetry immensely. I was well acquainted with her, and she was a friend, a close friend, a classmate of my first wife. And she was shy to read her poetry to broader audience. She wrote it, she read it she read it only to her classmate, which later happened to be my wife.
Dissident now.
Yes. Then I became acquainted with her.
She's in the book.
Yeah, close. Yes.
Well, I have a privilege to be
Closely
another person.
acquainted. I like some of her poems, I know them by heart. Послушай, Барток, что ты сочинил, как будто ржавую кастрюлю починил, как будто выстукал по ней тарам-тарам, как будто горы заходили по горам, как будто реки заходили колесом, как будто руки удлинились камышом, и камыши надшкатили и белыми носами корабли царапают по белым пристаням, царапают царап-царап-тарам. Еще играет преневоленный оркестр, а публика повскакивала с мест и в раздевалку, и на ходу она шипит, какой нахал, а ты им след поешь. Тили, Господи, просветления не спошли. That's one of the most beautiful poems in the Russian language, I would say. So I liked it very much. Unfortunately, I never translated her. Well, but we were close friends, rather close friends to the very end of Gorbanevska's life. She died in Paris not very long ago.
2013.
Yes. I am happy that you remembered her. I write about her in that book.
Yeah, it's a kind of personal question, but as
Yes,
you said, I mean,
yes, that's an important question. But that's an example of the fact that resistance, as such, to some degree, overcomes the poetic resistance. Okay.
Austra?
I also have a kind of personal question. Oh, thank you very much. What do you make of today's Lithuania? Do you think the independence brought what you would think it would bring to Lithuania? You mentioned some Soviet legacies. Do you think Lithuania is on the way being free from those legacies?
Well, if I lived in Lithuania all the time, I don't know my reaction to that. Now I will be able to check it. I visit Lithuania during the last 20 years. I visit Lithuania at least twice a year. And I definitely feel that it becomes a regular European country. A regular European country and with very intensive cultural life. At present, I moved to Vilnius partly because of the intense cultural life. Beautiful theatrical performance, beautiful music, good exhibitions, and so on and so on. To say nothing about Vilnius architecture, which was of former centuries mainly. Although now they also build interesting buildings. So now I am very optimistic about Lithuania, probably much more optimistic than most of the Lithuanians themselves. Well, we'll see, but I don't see much difference. There is this concealed, latent hatred, not necessarily anti-Semitic hatred, but yes, even more broad. There is it. But probably it exists in almost every country. Some countries are luckier, some countries less lucky. Lithuania, in this sense, belongs to less lucky countries. But I also meet the younger generation, and my feeling is that the younger generation has much less of it, if at all. Maybe not. So I am still very optimistic about Lithuania.
No, you said it's big.
Yes.
More questions?
Can I get to Asha's question?
Yes.
It's because your answer to a question, I think, seems to be more optimistic than the sentiment that you expressed in your 2010 essay. If I'm not mistaken, it was titled, "I'm Suffocating."
Mm-hmm. The essay...
And in that one, I mean, you were pretty pessimistic, trying to kind of analyze some negative trends.
A good journalist always has to overstate his or her case.
Okay, so that kind of overstated.
Yes,
okay.
That was partly an overstatement. I spoke about the rightist part of the Lithuanian public opinion. They were extremely обижены.
Offended.
Yeah, insulted, offended. They were extremely offended because I mentioned their names. And they said, well, they are philosophers such and such, philosophers such and such, philosophers such and such. And my point was that they were not philosophers. They were journalists, mediocre journalists calling themselves philosophers. So for that they were extremely offended. But my point was in offending them. So, of course it is an overstatement. I am suffocating.
Okay. There was another question.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's a small question. Twice I heard you use the word zero, of human beings as zero, and the poet is supposed to give what one of the poets said. It's important to give the zero a face. What I want to know is, in Swedish we have the word for a person, han är en nolla, hon är en nolla. But is it a Lithuanian or a Russian?
No, it was from Brodsky's, Joseph Brodsky, noble speech, and he was not saying that the person is a zero. You're saying that the powers that be, the manipulating totalitarian ideologies want to turn a person into a cog, to manipulate him, to turn him into zero, and into this zero a poet gives a face, or through poetry a person acquires back his face. Well, but you can have this printout if you...
Yes, thank you.
No, that's all.
I would be happy. I don't believe that it was the poets that made people into zeros. I just wanted to know if
the politicians.
But this, to use the word zero, if it is special for the cultural environment.
It's
Russia
a metaphor. Has nothing special about it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Two more questions.
Two more questions. Okay.
Thank you again very much for the nice evening and for your readings, especially. I would like to ask a question about Lithuanian literature, actually, and not poetry, though I expect that you get most questions about it. What are 2 or 3 probably prosaic works which you think are most important for Lithuanian literature and you would like to recommend anyone to read as very important works of Lithuanian literature?
2 or 3 very important works of Lithuanian literature in prose, if you could recommend.
Yes, I definitely can recommend some people. I think Lithuanian poetry today, there are some talented poets like Patackas, like Marchėnas, and probably
2 or 3 books of classical.
Of classical.
Not necessarily classical, but rather prose.
Prose or
important books. Most important
books. Yes. As is commonly known, the first and probably the most important Lithuanian writer is Donelaitis. This is the 18th century author, Lutheran pastor, priest, who wrote an epic on Lithuanian peasant life.
That's poetry.
That's poetry.
She wants prose.
Well, that's poetry. Okay, but poetry which has been translated into many languages, including English, including German. The German translation is not bad. The English is bad. Then I don't know about Swedish, but probably not, and that's a bit a pity. But in our poetry, it is at least as important as Stegner in Swedish poetry. Now about the fiction, a writer whom I like is Vaižgantas. A 19th and 20th century fiction writer with a romantic tinge, but at the same time very, very realistic, even naturalistic. He is comparable, in my opinion, to Russian classics.
What's his name?
Vaižgantas. It is his pseudonym. He wrote under the name Tomas. And in today's Lithuanian fiction, I would especially plays about dramas. The best drama writer, the best playwright is Marius Ivaškevičius. Definitely. Marius Ivaškevičius, who has a European stature, his plays are performed throughout Europe. Recently I saw his play about Leo Tolstoy in Vilnius Theatre. The play has the device which was used before Ivaškevičius by Bulgakov. The Leo Tolstoy does not appear at all. Only his wife and his friends are around, and partly the characters of Anna Karenina. But the play is definitely good. And all the plays of Ivaškevičius I have seen or read are definitely good. So I very much recommend him. Okay. There is also a prose writer who is very popular, Kristina Sabaliauskaitė, who wrote a historical novel, a novel with sequels. There are 4 volumes. It is a saga of a Lithuanian noble family in the 17th, 18th centuries. It's best-selling book, very liked also in Poland. Kristina lives in London, and well, she is in a sense she is an emigre. Part of the last volume takes part in England. And I recommend it. People say that it's quite a good reading.
Kristina
Sabaliauskaitė.
Sabaliauskaitė. Last question?
Last question?
Last question?
Yeah.
Last question number 2. Go for it.
But please, as loud as possible,
Yes,
because I don't hear well.
So my last question is to continue a little bit on my previous question.
Yes.
And I like to consider myself one of these younger, optimistic people. Though I've been growing pessimistic lately in the past few years, seeing what is happening in Lithuania, and as I see studies that show that Lithuania is among those countries that have the lowest level of tolerance, not only in terms of anti-Semitism, but also towards people of different, or LGBT, gay people, Muslims, and I was wondering what is your explanation? What is happening? I mean, this is not just Lithuania. We see the same trend in several other post-Soviet countries. Why is this?
Well, okay. So there is. You are right, and there are political groups who are interested in encouraging those feelings. But I also believe that it is less pronounced in the younger generation. It is less pronounced. The younger generation travels. The younger generation lives in Europe, in America. The younger generation creates...
but Europe is becoming itself,
yes,
moving into this direction.
To some degree. But for example, Poland and Hungary, they became rightist, almost dictatorships, nationalist rightist dictatorships. Lithuania did not become. Although there are political groups which would like to see such Lithuania as today's Poland or Hungary. But you know, speaking about optimism, I will finish with a joke which I tell very often. There are optimists and there are historical optimists. The optimists say everything will end well, and the historical optimists, I belong to the historical optimists, they say everything will end well, but I will not live to see it. I also talked with one Russian dissident and with one Ukrainian political personality. And the Russian dissident said, and I am a strategical optimist. Everything will end well, but I don't know how. But the best and the was the Ukrainian answer. He said, and I am an apocalyptic optimist. Everything will end well, but nobody will live to see it.
Oh, God. And this optimistic note.
Ну-ка чуть-чуть. Ну я потом уже пойду домой.
Да, я вас...
No, I'm finished. I don't care.
I always, from my early childhood, I always mix vegan